All right, everybody look up front. We're talking about refining crude oil. This is something everybody needs to know in order to understand how it's produced. See this little hyphen right here? That was something I should have fixed. We got to start where the process starts. So the term crude is given to oil that's in a natural state. Crude oil is called petroleum. Now, my dad worked in the oil patch years ago, back in the 50s, and he said the best grade of oil that they pump out of the ground is clear and it's green. If you saw it in a jar, you'd see clear green oil.
Petroleum jelly is clear oil.
So it looks like gas.
Well, petroleum jelly is something else entirely. So they claim that the long-term decay of plant and animal matter combined with high heat and tremendous pressure cause organic reactions over time to form crude oil and coal and all that. Do you know where the richest coal fields on the planet are?
No.
Underneath Antarctica?
Vegas.
Go figure, you know. There used to be old growth forest down there a long time ago. It's got semi-solids, liquids, and gases, composed of a lot of different hydrocarbons, which are compounds of hydrogen and carbon. Jonathan! All right. So, crude oil also contains some impurities: sulfur, oxygen, nitrogen, trace amounts of metals, and salt water. Okay? You know it had all that stuff in it.
What's salt water?
Salt water is in the ground. And a little story about that. It's kind of funny. There was I went down there to work at the offshore services. You know, I was mechanicing down there back in the late 70s. And this guy that we were right down there close to the coast. And and the guy that I was working under says, when I first came to work here, I asked him how come we didn't have our own well and our own pump. And so he says, so I went down there. They said that the well went dry. And he says, no well goes dry that's close to the Gulf Coast. So I went down there and I took the pump apart and I found out the nut had come off the impeller in the pump. I just assumed since there wasn't no water coming out, but the pump was running, the well was gone dry. So I put a nut on the impeller and it started getting water out of there, but it was salt. So if a freshwater well goes salty, you're done. If you keep pumping out of it, it won't do that. See, but because the nut came off the impeller, that well went bad. And all that. So, but anyway, trace amounts of metals and salt water. So once oil exploration teams have located an oil deposit, a drilling rig is used to bore a hole through dirt and rock and reach the oil. And then fracking is something different. But anyway, these rigs can drill a well up to 5 miles deep. They can also drill crooked. They can drill at an angle. They're really sharp. They do that kind of stuff. All right, so you got a steel tower here. And my dad used to work in these towers, and he said that they paid him $0.05 an hour extra because he had to buy gloves all the time because he had to be up in the derrick and handle those cables and all. And they told him not to tell the other guys that he was getting an extra $0.05 an hour because everybody wanted a pay raise. They didn't want to go there. All right, so once it strikes oil, natural pressure forces the crude oil to the surface in cases like that. There is enough crude oil under Colorado alone, and these are government, these are oil drilling leases out there. I heard on the radio the other day, $17 trillion worth of crude oil under the state of Colorado.
Why don't we just drill it and sell it for the debt?
Well, because the powers that be don't like fossil fuels. Even though there's so much fossil fuel and it's not hurting anything, they don't like it. They don't like coal, they don't like oil, they don't like anything. They want everybody to be using water and sunlight. There ain't enough of that out there to provide our energy needs, and there never will be. The crude oil is there for a reason. We need to be using it. And there's enough natural gas under the state of Texas to supply all of the energy needs of the country for something like 1,300 years. So we got plenty of stuff out there. Only 15% of the oil drilling leases in the United States are privately owned. The rest of them are controlled by the government, and they got pretty much all of those shut off. The government ones are. And so the ones that, the 15% that are still producing, are now producing more oil than Saudi Arabia. That's why the oil prices are down like they are. And all that. So they started cranking up all that oil production. So if you got low pressure, if there's a lack of pressure to force the oil, you use a pump to draw the oil through the well. And they continue to pull oil from the well until the supply is exhausted. Well, that takes a long time for some of them. There's this one lady that I knew that had a bunch of mineral rights that she owned on land, pieces of land in Louisiana, and she would get royalties from them pumping the oil out of there. And so every month that she'd get $1,200-$1,500, and they would pay her oil royalties and all. If you ever have a piece of land and you sell it, make sure you hang on to the mineral rights if you owned them to start with, right? Okay, so once the crude oil is recovered from the ground, it's moved to the refinery through a pipeline or by ship, railroad, or truck, and then they start refining it. We're going to talk about refining here now. All right, we got to clean it up. Some of the impurities are removed as the crude oil is run through a cleansing station and desalter, which looks kind of like this right here. You can kind of get a little picture of what it works like. Got enough, if you're like Jonathan, you may want to build your own desalter at the house or something. But don't make whiskey, you know what I'm saying? All right, in the smaller parts, they got distillation. You know, how do you distill something?
You run it through coals.
What? Yeah, well, you're sort of, you know, sort of there. But like if you're gonna distill water, what's the purpose of it? Why are you distilling something anyway?
Clean it.
Get rid of the heavy stuff. Right, so what you do, if you took something like a tank here and you got maybe a cone-shaped lid with you know what you're talking about, a piece of copper, you're thinking about whiskey, right? But over here, that's basically, well, over here on the other side, you got a tank that's gonna catch it. So if you boil this, and you boil it and let the steam come up through that tube and turn back into water, you know, or whatever the liquid is, and it draws on the other side, you wind up with all the crud and the you know, the minerals and everything on the bottom of this. I mean, there's a lot more to making whiskey than that, and I'm not saying anybody ought to be making whiskey like it. Untaxed liquor is illegal. But I can tell you a funny story about that too. My father-in-law used to train bloodhounds. And so one day he would dress his wife, my mother-in-law, up in these fatigues, the old military fatigues, and put a hat on her. And they would go down there and they would unload out of that station wagon. He would, you know, she would wear this hat, and he would have them smell of the hat that she was wearing. And then she would go hide somewhere, and the dogs would go find her. You know. And he trained dogs for the state of Florida, you know, for the sheriff's department and all. That's what he did. He was a bloodhound trainer. Well, one day they went out and they did one of these exercises by a pond out there. They didn't pay attention to what was going on with the pond. They just did it and went back down the car. And he got back and down at the store, these guys were saying, these two government folks come out here with military fatigues and dogs. And they said, we got so scared that we busted our still and poured all our moonshine out. And he couldn't have cared less about their moonshine. But they were scared because they were doing something they weren't supposed to. That's a funny story. That's true too, I didn't make that up. All right, so what you got here, distillation involves boiling a liquid and condensing the vapors, therefore obtaining a purer substance, okay? So you get your crude oil going through here, right? Through a furnace, and then it comes up in here. All right, now you might notice that up in the top, you got, and we'll talk about this on another second slide, 150 degrees Celsius, you get gasoline. A little bit lower, you get kerosene. You go lower, you get diesel oil, so you get 300 degrees Celsius, fuel oil. And then down in the bottom, you're going to have your lubricating oil, paraffin wax, and asphalt, and all that kind of stuff. So the farther you go down in that thing, the heavier the stuff gets. Because hydrocarbon compounds are found in crude oil, boil and condense at different temperatures. That allows for the separation and collection of discrete compounds, such as those that make up tar, fuel oil, gasoline. Among those is called fractional distillation. Gives you a kind of a picture of how that stuff works. And incidentally, this is a different word than D-I-S-C-R-E-E-T. It's actually each one of them is separate for itself. Fractional distillation is used to break down crude oil into these, you know, this is basically by their boiling thickness. You notice the thicker stuff's on the bottom and all that. And so basically you're getting your butane out of the very top. And your gasoline blending components is another one out under that. And then you got naphtha, you know, which is kind of like mineral spirits or whatever. And then you got your kerosene and jet fuel and distillate, and that's what the heating oil you get. Between, yeah, there's your, see down there, see how it goes there? You keep going, you got heavy gas and oil, and finally you got residual fuel oil, which is, I guess that's what they use to heat their houses up north. All right, almost 20 gallons of automotive gasoline can be made from a single barrel of petroleum. Did you know that a barrel of petroleum was only 42 gallons? You know that? It's a 42-gallon barrel. It's what's considered a barrel of oil, not 55 gallons, which is a drum like we're thinking. 42 gallons is a barrel of oil. And figure 4, I don't have up here. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. The rough breakdown of the yield from a barrel of crude, I've already showed you that, okay? So you got gasoline, kerosene, jet fuel, diesel fuel, residual fuel oil, other products. So you get a lot of gasoline. And the rest of the stuff, I mean, you know, most of the rest of this stuff, like they used to say, when I worked down in the, you know, where the oil refineries were and everything in Port Arthur, Texas, they used to claim that gasoline was the waste after they got everything else out that they didn't need. Gasoline was what was left over. You know, it's basically.
So they can get all that out of one run through of the entire thing?
Yeah, I mean, this is all the stuff that comes out of the crude oil. What else is made out of crude oil that you use every day?
Engine oil.
Plastic. Plastic's made out of oil. You know, I mean, if it was, can you imagine how much different this world would be without plastic? I mean, nobody would have a credit card, okay? Think about it. Without that, we wouldn't have credit cards, would we? All right. I guess we'd find out something like that. All right. The raw gasoline that's collected in the fractionating tower is known as straight-run gas. And like other distillates, straight-run gasoline needs further refining before it can be used in automotive applications. You can't just use straight-run gas. Like, as a matter of fact, this one, when I was out there working in Texas, this one boy says that his daddy's truck had never run right because he had run drip in it when it was new. And that's basically the straight-run stuff that just drips out of there, and he's putting it in there running. There's this other guy that I worked for that had a Mercedes. It was a brand new Mercedes. It was in 1980, and it was a diesel. And he was running Jet A1 in it, which is what you run through helicopters, which is like kerosene. And it's too dry and too hot, and it kind of messed up the injector pump, and he lost a lot of his power. He got to where it didn't run right after that. I think he got rid of it and replaced it with a gas burner Mercedes. My dad was saying there's this one guy when he was working in the oil field out there that kept getting so many traffic tickets because he was always driving so fast they took his car away from him and wouldn't let him drive anymore because he got too many traffic tickets. So he bought an airplane. That's where he flew. Because in Texas, you know, you can land an airplane everywhere out there where they were. Refineries use a lot of processes to obtain more gasoline and better quality gasoline from distillates. You got a regenerator, a main column, and a reactor. I used to drive by and see these things whenever I would go to work. When I was working at Sabine, I would drive through the Gulf Oil Refinery. There's a highway going out through the middle of it and going down there. And I will tell you this, anytime I was anywhere in Port Arthur, I always smelled this petroleum production. And it was, you know, you got used to it. I mean, it just smelled oil in there all the time. Another little brief story. I was driving my this little Volkswagen I had my daughter and my oldest son with me. My youngest son wasn't born yet. And I had like 40, 50 bucks in my pocket, and I wasn't even watching the gas gauge, and I ran out of gas over there behind Texaco Research. And I said, oh, good grief. And I told my daughter, I said, stay here with Matt, and I'll, you know, come back in a minute with something we can pour in here and all that. So I went over there and knocked on the back door of this Texaco Research. This guy with a lab coat come here and said, hey, yeah, what do you want? I said, I got run out of gas. I got to get something, you know, that I can pour in there. You know, I got a can. I got money and all this kind of stuff. And the guy says, he handed me this white, this clear bottle and a big cork in it, and it said toluene on it. And he says, pour that in there. It'll run off of that. I went over and poured it in there, and it ran so good off of that. I went back to the gas station, filled up, and it ran better off of that tank of gas that had that toluene in it than I've ever seen anything before. Okay. So one of the processes is catalytic cracking that makes lighter gasoline fractions out of heavy distillates. Now another refinery process, straight run gasoline, is reformed and it changes the molecular structure to produce higher octane gasoline. Higher octane gasoline burns slower than lower octane gasoline, and it will make a mess in a combustion chamber of a vehicle that's supposed to run on 87. If it's supposed to run on 87, run it on 87. Putting premium gas in there is not going to help you if your vehicle's set up to run on 87. However, if you're supposed to be running premium gas, run premium gas. That's the whole thing. To improve the quality, you put additives in it to supply desired performance and storage characteristics. And these additives are chemical agents that are mixed with gasoline and diesel fuel by the oil companies before the fuel is tested and rated. So we'll look at some of these additives and see why they're used. Antioxidants decrease the tendency to oxidize. So prolonged exposure to air can oxidize gasoline, which reduces its quality. Now, a lot of you guys may or may not know this, and this would be something interesting that you probably can bounce off of Matt. If you've got a return fuel system going into a diesel, if the diesel fuel that's going back into the tank is spraying out above the fuel in the tank, it will turn into tar, just pure old black tar, and it'll clog up screens and all that kind of stuff. That's why you'll always see those things going down into the bottom underneath the fuel, so that it doesn't get oxidized. That's kind of what they're talking about here. But you know, that's something that will happen with diesel. That's one of the things that whenever I was, you know, dealing with all this. And a lot of times you'll see that. If you see this gummy tar in a diesel fuel tank, it's because the return is actually spraying out into the air above the gas in the tank. You know what I'm saying? Or excuse me, above the fuel in the tank.
So it just does it slowly and don't do it quick?
No, you got to put it underneath the level, all the way to the bottom of the tank. Let it go where it don't ever see any air, and you won't typically have that problem. You know, but if you're misting it out in there, you know. All right, so you got gum and deposits, that's what I was talking about, fuel system components and engine performance. You got anti-rust agents blended into gasoline to reduce rust and corrosion, which can clog or damage components in the fuel delivery system. Tell you something else, rust is so fine that you can actually, rust will actually come through a fuel filter and stop up fuel injectors. All right. Then we got
Mess up the
detergents.
pump.
Huh?
Will mess up the pump.
Yeah, well, usually they'll get through the pump because it's so fine. But anyway, we got, they did have, there was another kind of detergent. When they first started coming out with fuel injectors, they were putting olefins and diolefins and stuff in gasoline. And it was kind of like little tiny black particles that they called a special kind of a detergent. And they were thinking that whenever these things would go through the injectors, it would basically keep them sort of sandblasted clean. But what would happen was when the injectors closed and the engine was hot, it would trap some of those and it would start to bake them onto those pindles. And over time, injectors would start getting clogged up, you know, with this olefin stuff. And furthermore, it started piling up on the intake valves. And it's really absorbs octane really well, so when it would pile up on the intake valves, when you crank it up cold, that octane initially from your cold start would be soaked up by the olefins that were piled up on those valves, and it would cause them to be a mess. Now, gasoline direct injection engines have got the same kind of problem with crud building up on the valves because there's not any gasoline spraying on the valve. So sometimes you got to clean the intake valves on gasoline direct injection vehicles because of that crud that gets built up on it. And that's the end of the show. Who learned something they didn't know before? Everybody did. That's what we're in here for. Didn't take us long. Short presentation.